you for the wonderful introduction, and thank you to everyone who's joining us today for Innovation and Intellectual Property, What You Need to Know. I'm Laurie Hood, and I'm the Chief Marketing Officer at Mobile Walla. If you're not familiar with Mobile Walla, we provide data, predictive features, and feature engineering technologies that help enterprises around the world build high-performing machine learning models. We're excited to be partnering with Data Science Connect for our second year in sponsoring this conference. Through this partnership, we've really enjoyed the opportunity to work with such an awesome community of people focused on data science. So joining me today is Elizabeth Lester. Elizabeth has extensive experience in IP law and is currently Assistant General Counsel, Intellectual Property at Equifax, and is Vice Chair IP Awareness for the Georgia Intellectual Property Alliance, GIPA. She's a former colleague and she's also a friend, so I'm delighted to be able to talk with her today. Based on my interaction with the group of people involved in Data Science Connect, I know that many of you have an entrepreneurial bent or a great idea that you want to bring to market. So we're going to start this discussion with some of the basics. So Elizabeth, what do you mean when you talk about intellectual property? And how do I know if my idea or innovation even counts?
It's a great question and one that most people have. And I think intellectual property and the idea of it can be really intimidating. But I like to try to simplify it for people. So intellectual property is the legal rights that are associated with things that are intangible. So legally, there's 4 different categories of intellectual property, and that's patents, trademarks, copyrights, and trade secrets. And there's certain legal rights that are associated with each of these. And one thing that's important to understand is that they're based on geography. So by country, each country has its own laws for protecting these. And while there's treaties globally, a US patent isn't necessarily going to protect you and your invention in Canada. So something you'll need to think about pretty early on is whether your idea is going to be used outside the US or just in the US. But whether or not your idea or innovation counts is technically a fairly dicey analysis. There's a lot of legal assessment that goes into that. Typically, you want to look at whether or not it's something new. Is the idea new, or is it something that is obvious? If it's not, if it doesn't meet either of those criteria, then you're probably not worried about patent protection. But at the same time, if it is something that's new, technically, and if it is something that you think isn't necessarily obvious, then you might want to consider looking at patent protection. And that's important because if you disclose your invention or your idea without having a patent application on file, you can lose the ability to protect it later. So it's something you need to think about pretty early on.
Okay, awesome. So you tossed around a lot of different terms, difference between a trademark and a patent, or the R with the little circle around it, registered trade. What do they mean, and how do I know which one I need?
Okay, so the patent is protecting the technology, right? The patent is protecting your machine learning algorithm or the process that you're using for matching and cleaning data, right? All of those types of things are what you typically protect with a patent. The trademark is used to protect the brand, right? Whatever your product name is, your business name is. So Mobile Walla, right? That's a registered trademark. Equifax is a registered trademark. And the circle R means that you have a federal trademark registration with the US Patent and Trademark Office. A little TM or an SM is often used if you don't have that registration. And you still can have legal rights even without the federal registration.
So you can trademark without the federal registration, but registered trade, hence federal registration. And the SM is a service mark, right?
Right.
Difference between a service mark and a trademark?
Really, you can use both kind of interchangeably. Service marks typically apply to things that are professional services or something like that, rather than a good or a product of some type. I tend to use TM rather than SM just because it's easier.
Well, that's as good a reason as any. So, and it's funny, I'm taking notes because this is super helpful to me as well. So, if I'm thinking of starting a business, I want to look at a patent for my idea, but I want to look at a trademark to protect the brand aspects of that business.
Absolutely. And one thing you'll also want to do is a quick search to make sure that other people aren't using the same name that you want to use. You can do that. The US Patent and Trademark Office has a website. You can do that. You can even just do a quick Google search, um, just to put in the name and see if other people are using the same name. If it's really descriptive name, right? So if you say, I'm coming up with a credit score, right? You're not going to be able to protect that name, because it's too descriptive and everybody's using it. But if you're coming up with a fun, creative name, something that's different, like one that my data scientist came up with when they developed a new machine learning algorithm was neurodecision. And so we actually were able to protect that, right? So you can kind of tell the difference between what you can protect and not that way.
Okay. What and you talked a little bit about this in the first question. What are the implications? Let's see, I come up with something, but it's protected in the UK. What are the implications if there's protection or being used in other countries versus the US? And how did those considerations come into play?
So, if you know that somebody else is using the same technology in another country, you might want to look and see if they have patent protection in that country. And then you'll also want to look and see, even if they're not in your market, they may still have a patent that applies in the market, right? So, I've seen people who aren't operating yet in the US. Who are from the UK, but they still file a US patent because they plan to expand there. And remember earlier, I said you have to make that decision about foreign patent filing kind of early. So it's something, even if it's not being used, there could be other patents that protect it in the current market. Um, so while that's always an issue, I think it's also really hard to make sure that there isn't somebody else already with patent protection unless you're really clear on the specifics of what your invention is. A patent attorney can work with you and do what's called a clearance or freedom to operate. And so that's where they will do a search and they'll find lots of different patents of other people and they'll review them to see if there's a problem with what you're wanting to do. Um, in the data space and technical technology space, that can be a real challenge.
Okay. Very interesting. So if someone is just starting out, kind of what are the basics? What are the 3 to 5 things that they want to do to get this started?
So I think one thing is to sit down and make sure you know what your business plan is, right? And to make sure you understand, is this a new way of doing things? If it is, you want to talk to an IP attorney pretty early in the process, I think. Now, it's also important to make sure that they understand what your business objectives are, right? Because a patent may not be the right thing for you. You may want to protect it as a trade secret. Most people will protect source code as a trade secret. And a lot of things that are more back office function can also be protected as a trade secret very easily. And that only costs you what it takes to actually keep it a secret, right? So the protections you put in place there. Um, but sometimes the patent is the right thing to do, and that can be especially true for startup companies. Um, because what happens is they like to see investors like to see patents, right? Like if you've ever watched Shark Tank, they always ask, "Have you filed a patent?" Right? Because patents are assets that you can track on your your balance sheet, right? Like it's an intangible asset, just like any other type of intangible asset that you would have.
Talk a little bit. We've kind of come at this from I'm doing this on my own, or I'm doing this to start a company. But talk a little bit, and I know you have a ton of experience with this on I'm in a big company, and some of this work has been an outgrowth of the work I've done there, or I work on a team in a big company and we think we've done something cool. What is typically that internal process that someone should go to? Who do they want to look for internally? That sort of thing, if they want to raise this up. Because I mean, patents are cool for everybody.
Right, right. And a lot of companies have in-house intellectual property teams that are there to help with this type of stuff, but a lot of companies don't. And so I think a couple of different things that you can look for within your company. One would be talk to other people who may have gone through the process before. If you know that your company has patents, maybe find another inventor and find out how they went about getting it protected. If you do have a formal department, they usually have a process for you to submit what they call either an invention disclosure or an idea disclosure. And so at Equifax, that's what we have in place. And I work with my teams and encourage inventors or people who come up with ideas to submit those. And I think something that's really important is the concept of invention is often really intimidating, right? And people think that you have to be an Einstein or an Edison, right? And that that's the level of innovation that we're talking about. But it's really not. It can be improvements on processes, right? If you come up with a way to reduce the amount of processing power that's needed to speed up like major, like big computations with big data, that can be something that can be protected, even if aspects of it may have been known. Um, Also, if you identify a problem that people didn't know existed, sometimes discovering that problem and then figuring out how to work around that can also in itself be something that can be protected. So I really encourage teams to reach out to their in-house legal departments. If you have one, if you don't, then talk to whoever would be the person to engage them, right? And I think mentioning to them and saying, hey, maybe we should look at intellectual property protection for this. We should figure out if it's something we should file a patent application on, or if it's something we want to protect as a trade secret. And I think being able to speak that language is always really helpful. Now, the nice thing is if you have that in-house department, they're going to hold your hand through the process. That's my job at Equifax, right? My job is to make sure that my inventors feel comfortable with working with the outside patent lawyers that I hire and I'm responsible for managing. And they go through that process and they prepare the patent application and then they file it. And so the initial process can be a little scary, but usually once you've done it one or two times, it becomes a little bit easier. My inventors always joke that the first time you read a draft of a patent application that's written by a lawyer, you're like, that doesn't sound anything like my idea. And then they have to explain why, they're using the terminology they're using in the patent application. So it's important not to let the process scare you, and just to find the right resources. And if you're not sure, you can always go to websites like the Georgia Intellectual Property Alliance, and reach out to us, and we're happy to help guide you and provide you with feedback on that. The US Patent and Trademark Office has a lot of great information on their website for entrepreneurs and small businesses. And if you happen to fall within the requirements for pro bono legal support, there's also pro bono assistance available to people who are filing things on their own. And the fees are often discounted heavily for independent inventors or small entities.
I would also expect or hope some of, like, I know in Atlanta we've got a lot of venture groups and things like that, that they'd be able to provide guidance to people participating in their programs, because it is so critical. And especially, while this event is global, I mean, we're Elizabeth and I are both Atlanta based, and it's a big tech town, and I know there'll be a lot of Atlanta people joining us. What is typically, I think sometimes too, people get discouraged by the time process associated with applying for a patent. Are there levers you can pull to make it faster? Are there things you do that make it slower? And what does it usually take?
Absolutely. You can get a patent examined and issued in less than 12 months if you need the protection and you need it quickly. There's ways to do that. You pay additional fees, but the fees again are really reduced for small independent micro entities or small entities, right? A company like Equifax pays more to use that process, but you can get a decision sometimes within 6 months of filing an application.
Oh,
Um,
wow.
so it's really crazy. It kind of depends on the technology area that you're filing in. Um, but it's a really good way to get a quick decision. Sometimes you don't need a decision quickly. Sometimes you just want to have the patent application
Yeah.
pending,
Yeah.
right? And that's especially true if you're looking at trying to build up your portfolio and your assets and to sell your company in the not too distant future. Or if you're still developing it, right? You can file lots of applications covering different new features if that seems like the right thing to do. And that can be beneficial because as you continue to innovate, you may have already disclosed particular features in an application, and then you can amend your claims and change your scope of protection to make sure you're capturing what's the most relevant, as long as it's disclosed in the original application.
Yeah.
So there's a
Yeah.
lot of different strategies associated with that. And again, it seems intimidating. Sometimes patents can be pending for years. There's things I filed years ago that have not been examined, but at the same time, we're not looking to assert it necessarily at this
Yeah.
point. And so it can be helpful, just to have it out there pending so people know that you're claiming you have certain rights in that invention.
So we've touched on this a little bit, and sort of overall intimidation in the process. Getting lawyers involved always sounds expensive. So, can I do this myself? Are there resources? If I have to skimp somewhere, what, maybe just a little bit to what's the prioritization, and what's most critical to invest in.
So typically, I would say the patent is not something you want to skimp on. But most attorneys will do a flat fee for the patent, right? They won't necessarily charge you hourly rates. And so that's something to be aware of. And most attorneys will give you that information up front. They'll say, we think that this will cost this much money for us to file a patent on. Um, there are costs as you go through the patent process, so it's important to know that up front as well. Some law firms will also even do sort of like a delayed payment for startups. There's a few law firms I know of that do that, and so it's worth asking about different types of alternative fee arrangements that they may have. That's always that's a key word, alternative fee arrangement, right?
Alternative?
Alternative fee arrangement and flat fee. Those are two of the little words that you want to use when you're talking to a lawyer. Something else is you want to make sure you're working with a lawyer that's used to working with companies that are similarly situated to you, right? So if you're a startup, make sure you find someone who's worked with other startups. If you know people in other startups, ask them who they use, right? Referrals are going to be one of your best resources. Just like in any other industry, if you're having construction done on your house or looking for a plumber, it's always word of mouth, right? And for IP law, that's no different.
And you definitely want to find someone who specializes in IP law, not your, cousin's wife's brother who has a broad practice. I mean, there's definitely a high degree of specialization
There
here.
is, especially for patents. Patent attorneys actually take an additional bar exam in order to be able to practice with the US Patent and Trademark Office. And so, in addition to whatever state that they did their bar examination in, so like here in Georgia, I took the Georgia bar exam, but I also had a completely separate exam with the US Patent and Trademark Office. That means I'm a registered patent attorney. So you have to know all of the regulations and little quirks of filing a patent to be able to pass that.
So just in kind of in wrapping up, and for those of us joining today, I will send a follow-up email with some of the links that we've talked about. You've talked about the GIPA site being a good resource, and that's the Georgia Intellectual Property Alliance. And for those of you in other locations, there are multiple state chapters that function similarly, as well as a US Intellectual Property Alliance, and forthcoming a Global Intellectual Property Alliance. So those are all places that you can go and learn more. Resources, a good starting point. You talked about the US Patent and Trademark Office.
It's
Okay.
uspto.gov, and they have a ton of information. There's also the Mickelson. I can't remember specifically, but if you Google Mickelson, they have a ton of educational resources, as well as the Center for Intellectual Property Understanding. If you Google either of those, you'll be able to find their websites. And they have a lot of great educational information just so that you can get familiar with what the process is going to be. And that's intended for general audiences, not specifically IP lawyers.
Yeah, yes, I spend a lot of time with our lawyers, and often I feel like we're like talking about two different things in two different ways. And they're like, no, 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 this is how lawyers do it. I'm like, okay, then this is what we'll do. Um, what about, and you've talked about like the National Inventors Hall of Fame. I know you're super familiar with some of the resources around there. What would be good places for people to go who are just sort of thinking about some of this stuff?
Um, there's the National Academy of Inventors. There's and the National Inventors Hall of Fame. Both of them have a lot of great information. A lot of these organizations are also working on getting education out into the communities. So if you look for your local startup organizations, so Venture Atlanta, um, ATDC here in Atlanta, right? Like there's a ton of different acronyms. Usually they'll have contacts. So if you reach out to them, they'll be able to put you in touch or help identify resources. So, there's a lot of different things. The US Patent and Trademark Office also has different series on how to write a patent application or how to file, what to look for with a trademark search. And that's also available on demand on their website.
I want to thank you. This has been, I mean, I've learned a ton, and I think that our audience, you've shared some great information. I think with key points being, don't be afraid. This is super important. If you've got something that you want to patent or you want to trademark, you need to get out there and do it. And there are resources that can help you at different price points, and resources that can help educate you. So hopefully those of us joining us today found this to be a worthwhile session. And Elizabeth, again, I want to thank you. This has been a lot of fun for me. And I will say, I took a bunch of notes. I've learned a ton. So Thank you, everybody, and thank you to the team at Data Science Connect. We, like I said before, Mobile Wall is excited to be a sponsor, and we've been really glad to participate. So